They called me selfish. Imagine that. After 60 years of bleeding myself dry for everyone else, they used that word on me. Selfish. I am 70 years old. My hair has turned silver, my hands ache with arthritis, and every scar on my body is a ledger of sacrifices I made that no one ever cared to count. But the heaviest scar is the one you can't see, the one left when your own blood looks at you with disgust and says you took too much, when all you ever did was give. You think I'm exaggerating? That I'm just some bitter old woman ranting in the dark? No, I'm going to tell you everything. And by the time I'm done, you'll see. Selfish is the last word that should have ever been put in my mouth. The first time I was called that word was by my daughter, Rebecca. She stood in my kitchen with her perfect hair, her polished nails, her purse that probably cost more than I ever made in a month. She looked around the small apartment I'd managed to keep after losing the house, wrinkled her nose, and said, "Why do you always make everything about you? You're so selfish, Mom." Selfish. I didn't answer her then. I just stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, staring at the same hands that once sewed dresses out of curtains for her when she was a little girl, the same hands that worked double shifts to pay for her school trips, the same hands that hid bruises so she wouldn't be afraid. And she called me selfish. But that was only the beginning. My son Daniel followed. He who I had shielded from his father's drunken rages, who I once held against my chest while broken glass rained down around us. He looked me in the eye, calm and cold, and said, "You drain us, always have. You gave us nothing but problems." Do you know what it feels like to hear that from the child you nearly died bringing into the world? To stand there while the people who carry your blood rewrite your whole life as a burden, as a theft? I'll tell you this, it feels like being buried alive. And maybe that was their goal, to bury me under shame, under guilt, under silence. Because silence is convenient, isn't it? If I shut my mouth, no one would ever know the truth of what I gave, what I endured, what I lost. But silence is also a coffin, and I refuse to lie still. So listen closely. This is not a story of forgiveness. This is not a gentle tale of reconciliation. This is the story of a woman they tried to erase, a woman they called selfish, after she gave them everything. And it begins long before they ever dared to say the word. It begins in the house where I learned that giving can become a weapon, and that sacrifice, too much of it, turns into a curse. Because once you give people everything, they believe you owe them more. And when you finally stop, they call you selfish. They didn't call me selfish when I was young. Back then, the word they used for me was good. A good daughter, a good wife, a good mother, always bending, always silent, always giving. I was 19 when I married Robert, and I thought being good would save me. Robert was charming at first. That's how it always begins, isn't it? He had a smile that lit up the whole street, a way of making me feel like I was chosen, plucked out of obscurity. I came from nothing. My parents were poor, my dresses patched, my shoes borrowed more often than bought. When Robert asked me to marry him, I thought I was escaping that life. But the thing about charm is that it curdles. His smile soured the first year right after Rebecca was born. The first time he raised his voice, I told myself it was the stress of being a young father. The first time he raised his hand, I told myself it was the whiskey, but after a while, excuses become chains. Every time I thought of leaving, I heard my mother's voice in my head. A good woman stands by her husband. A good woman endures. So I endured. When Rebecca was 3, I worked nights scrubbing floors at the hospital so Robert could drink away the little money we had. When Daniel was born, I stitched together blankets from old coats because the heating broke, and Robert said it wasn't his job to fix it. When the 3rd child, Michael, arrived too early and too small, I sold my wedding ring for medicine because Robert said we couldn't afford both his cigarettes and the baby's pills. I never told the children. I thought I was protecting them. I thought if I could carry all the weight, they could grow up lighter, freer. I carried fists, hunger, lies. All so they could have smiles and photographs. Christmas mornings with presents, birthdays with cake, even if it meant I didn't eat for days. Do you know what it feels like to burn your own body, to keep others warm, to look into your child's face, thin and hungry, and know the only food left is on your plate? So you pretend you're not hungry and slide it across the table? That was my life. And yet, when people looked at us, they said we were a good family because I kept the bruises hidden, because I smiled with swollen lips, because I made sure no one ever saw the cracks in the walls. Silence was my duty. Sacrifice was my virtue. The children grew up in that silence. They never knew the things I hid. They never saw the blood I wiped away before they woke. And maybe that's where I made my mistake, believing that one day they would understand without me telling them, that one day they would see the truth written in my bones. But children see only what they're shown. And what I showed them was a woman who gave everything and asked for nothing. Rebecca saw me bend until my back nearly broke, and she learned that bending was weakness. She hated it. She hated me. Daniel saw me patch broken windows and beg for scraps. And he learned that poverty was shameful. He despised it. He despised me. Michael, my baby, saw me cradle him through storms. But he also saw Robert's rage, and part of him absorbed it like poison in his veins. And so the years passed. Robert drank himself into an early grave, leaving nothing but debt and scars behind. By then, I was already gray-haired, already stooped, already tired from decades of surviving. I thought maybe, finally, the children would see me, not as weak, not as a burden, but as a woman who had carried the weight of 3 lives on her shoulders. But instead, they called me selfish. Why? Because after Robert's death, I stopped giving, not all at once. At first, it was small things, saying no when Rebecca asked for money for a new car, refusing when Daniel hinted that I should sell my tiny apartment to help him invest, telling Michael I wouldn't babysit his children every night so he could drink with his friends. The first time I said no, they looked at me as though I'd slapped them. They weren't used to it. They weren't used to me taking even the smallest piece of myself back. And that's when the word came, selfish. But what they couldn't see, what they refused to see, was that I had nothing left to give. I had already given them my body, my health, my youth, my dreams. Every drop of me had been wrung out to keep them alive. And when I finally tried to keep just a crumb of myself, suddenly I was selfish. That's the curse of sacrifice. Once you train people to believe you'll give them everything, the moment you stop, they call you cruel. They twist your years of silence into proof that you owe them more. I sat in my kitchen after Rebecca's words that day, staring at the cracked linoleum floor, remembering all the meals I skipped, all the bruises I wore like armor, all the nights I prayed just to make it to morning. And I thought, maybe I really am selfish. Maybe wanting just a scrap of peace for myself is too much. But then I remembered something. A night long ago when Michael was still a baby. Robert had come home drunk, furious. He slammed his fists into the wall, shattered a chair against the floor. I stood between him and the crib, arms out, shaking, but unmovable. He called me selfish then, too. Selfish for not giving him the last of my paycheck for more whiskey. And I realized selfish was just another weapon. A word men used to keep women silent. A word children used to keep their mothers small. A word meant to bury me alive. But I am not buried, not yet. And if selfish means clawing back even one breath of freedom, then selfish is what I'll be. The word selfish echoed in my head for weeks. It clung to me like smoke, slipping under the door, seeping into my dreams. I would wake in the middle of the night, breathless, hearing Rebecca's sharp tone, Daniel's cold judgment, Michael's drunken mutter, selfish, selfish, selfish. And yet, when I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I saw not greed, but a woman with hollows beneath her eyes, shoulders sagging from decades of labor, hands warped by scrubbing and lifting and shielding. Tell me, what could I possibly have taken for myself? What feast did I gorge on while they starved? What luxury did I hoard while they suffered? The truth was simple. I had given everything, but in giving, I had erased myself. One night, I sat at my kitchen table, the clock ticking loud in the silence, and pulled out an old notebook. Its cover was torn, its pages yellow. I hadn't touched it in years, but that night I opened it and began to write. Not for them, for me. I wrote about the first bruise Robert left on my cheek, about the smell of whiskey on his breath as he called me worthless, about the way Rebecca cried in her crib and how I stood between them both, trembling but firm. I wrote about the winters when I burned broken furniture for heat, about selling my wedding ring for medicine, about the nights I sewed until dawn so my children wouldn't feel shame at school. The words poured out of me like blood from an old wound. My hand cramped, but I didn't stop. I wrote until my eyes blurred and my chest heaved with sobs I hadn't allowed myself to release in decades. When morning came, I closed the notebook, slid it under my bed, and told myself it was enough, that at least on those pages my truth lived. But truth, once freed, is not content to stay hidden. A week later, Rebecca visited again. She stood in my doorway, sighing heavily, her expensive perfume filling the air. "Mom," she said, "we need to talk. Daniel and I think maybe you should move into assisted living. You can't be on your own anymore." Assisted living, a cage dressed up as kindness. My throat tightened. I can manage." Rebecca rolled her eyes. "You can't. You don't understand how hard this is for us. You make everything about you. We're trying to protect you, and you're being selfish." There it was again, the word. Something inside me snapped. I looked at her. My daughter, my blood, the child I had once carried on my hip while I scrubbed floors, the child whose school tuition I had bought with blistered hands. And I said softly but firmly, "Do not call me that again." Rebecca blinked, startled. She wasn't used to me pushing back. "Excuse me?" I stood straighter than I had in years. My voice shook, but it carried. "I am not selfish. I gave you everything I had, more than I had. I broke my body for you. I stayed in hell for you. If I say no now, it is because I've earned the right to keep what little is left of me." Her face flushed. She stammered, her polished composure cracking. "You're delusional," she spat. "You rewrite history. You make yourself the victim. No wonder Dad drank. You drove him to it." Those words sliced me open. My breath caught. My knees wavered. For a moment, I nearly collapsed back into silence. Nearly. But instead, I whispered, "Leave." Rebecca's eyes widened. She waited, as if expecting me to apologize, to beg. But I didn't. I only pointed to the door. She stormed out, slamming it so hard the walls shook. I sank into a chair, trembling, tears streaming down my face. My chest burned, my hands shook. But beneath the fear, I felt something else. A spark, a pulse. For the first time in decades, I had not bowed. I didn't know it then, but that was the first crack in the coffin they had built for me. The next week, Daniel called. His voice was cool, professional. He didn't waste time. "Rebecca told me you were rude to her. What's wrong with you? We're trying to help. If you can't behave, maybe we'll have to make decisions for you." "Decisions?" I asked. "You know what I mean. About your finances. About where you live." My hands gripped the phone. "You think you can take my life away from me?" He sighed, impatient. "You've always been impossible, always draining. You should be grateful we even care enough to intervene. But no, you're too selfish for that." There it was, again. I hung up the phone before he could finish. My hands shook, my heart pounded, but I didn't call back. That night I returned to my notebook. My hand moved faster this time, fueled by anger instead of sorrow. I wrote about Rebecca's words, Daniel's threats, Michael's absence. I wrote about the twisting of truth, the way children turn a mother's sacrifice into shame. And as I wrote, something formed inside me. Not just grief, not just pain, but defiance. I realized that silence was the soil where their lies grew, that if I didn't speak, the world would only hear their version, that I was crazy, delusional, selfish. So I made a choice. The next evening, I walked to the community center. My legs trembled, my palms were damp, but I entered the small room where a group of women sat in a circle. Some I recognized from the neighborhood, widows, grandmothers, women with tired eyes. They looked up as I slipped inside. "Come sit," one said gently. And for the first time in my life, I opened my mouth, not to please, not to placate, not to beg, but to tell the truth. My voice shook, my hands trembled. I told them about Robert, about the bruises, about the hunger, about the sacrifices. about my children, who had erased me, who had buried me under the word selfish. The room was silent when I finished, but it was not the silence of erasure. It was the silence of listening, of being heard. Then one woman reached across the circle, her hand warm against mine, and said, "You're not selfish, you're surviving." And in that moment, I knew my children could call me any name they wanted. They could smear me, erase me, bury me. But I had found something stronger than their silence. I had found my voice. And once a voice is freed, it does not go back into the grave. I thought the circle would be the end of it, a small comfort, a hidden place where women like me whispered our truths in the safety of 4 cracked walls. But once you break silence, it doesn't stay contained. It leaks, it spreads, it grows. The first time I read from my notebook in that room, the women wept with me. The second time, they pushed me to share more. There's a story night next week. Ruth, the tall one with the silver braid, told me, "Anyone can stand and speak. You should." I laughed. "Me? No, my voice shakes just saying my name." But Ruth only smiled. "Your voice shakes because it's heavy. That doesn't make it weak. It makes it powerful." The night of the event, I nearly didn't go. I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching my notebook, hearing Rebecca's voice in my head. Selfish, dramatic, delusional. I saw Daniel's cool eyes, Michael's sneer. My children would never forgive me for speaking. They would call me worse names, bury me deeper. But something inside me whispered, "They've already buried you. What more can they do?" So I went. The hall was small, just a room above the library. The lights were dim, the air smelled faintly of dust and coffee. People stood one by one, reading poems, singing songs, telling stories. My hands shook so badly that when it was my turn, I nearly dropped the notebook. But I forced my legs forward. I stood, I opened my mouth, and I spoke. I told them about silence, how it grows like mold, creeping through every corner of your life until you can't breathe. I told them about Robert's fists, about burning chairs to keep children warm, about selling my wedding ring for medicine. I told them about Rebecca calling me selfish, Daniel threatening to take my life away, Michael drowning in his father's poison. My voice cracked, but it carried. The room was silent when I finished, but it wasn't the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of people holding their breath. Then the clapping began, hesitant at first, then louder, until the walls shook with it. Strangers came up to me afterward. One woman pressed my hand and whispered, "Thank you. I thought I was the only one." A young man said, "You sound like my mother. I wish she had spoken before it was too late." For the first time, my voice didn't feel like a burden. It felt like power, but power never goes unnoticed. 2 days later, my phone rang. Rebecca. Her voice was sharp, every word dipped in acid. "I heard about your little performance," she hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? People are talking. Do you know how humiliating this is for us?" My chest tightened, but I didn't shrink. I spoke the truth. Her laugh was bitter. "Your truth? You've always been dramatic, always craving attention. You can't keep your mouth shut, can you? You'll destroy everything. And for what? Pity?" Click. The silence afterward was worse than her words. It was the silence of a daughter turning her back, not just forgetting me, but burying me all over again. And then Daniel called. His voice was calm, professional, but every word was a knife. Mother, this has to stop. You're embarrassing yourself and us. People respect me in this town. Do you understand the damage you're doing? Enough. I said nothing. He sighed, exasperated. You have always been impossible, always making yourself the victim. Don't force me to take action. And then Michael, my baby, his voice thick with drink, slurred with rage. Shut your mouth, old woman, or you'll regret it. Each call was a blow, each word a fist. Once, I would have cowered, begged, torn my notebook to pieces. Once, I would have swallowed my voice whole, desperate for their approval. But not now, because here's what they didn't understand. Once silence is broken, the world sounds different. Their threats no longer felt like chains. They felt like proof. Proof that my voice had power. Proof that they feared me, and fear meant I was no longer theirs to bury. The next week, the community center held another gathering. This time, I didn't just bring my notebook. I brought one of my paintings, roses blooming through cracks of stone, their thorns sharp, their petals streaked with fire. I leaned it against the wall as I spoke. The room buzzed with whispers afterward. People touched my arm, thanked me, asked if they could read more of what I'd written. One woman pressed her cheek to mine and whispered, "You've given me courage." For the first time in decades, I stood tall, but triumph never comes without a price. The night of that second gathering, I saw them, my children, standing in the back of the hall, their faces masks of fury. Rebecca's lips pressed into a hard line, pearls gleaming at her throat. Daniel, arms folded, eyes sharp as blades. Michael, swaying slightly, his face red with drink. My blood froze. When I finished speaking, the applause filled the air. But then Rebecca's voice cut through it like a whip. "How dare you!" Gasps rippled through the crowd. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor. "How dare you stand here and spew lies? Do you know what you've done to us? To our name?" The applause died. Whispers erupted. Daniel's voice followed, calm but venomous. "You're embarrassing yourself. And us. This pity show. You think it makes you strong. It makes you pathetic." And then Michael, fists clenched, his voice a growl. "You should have stayed buried, old woman." The words hit me harder than any blow Robert had ever landed. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. My knees trembled, the old instinct to bow, to beg, to silence myself clawing up my throat. But then I looked past them, past their rage, past their judgment. I saw the faces in the crowd, strangers who had clapped, who had wept, who had whispered thanks. I saw Ruth in the corner, her braid gleaming silver, her eyes burning like fire. And I remembered every sacrifice, every bruise, every night of hunger, every silence I had swallowed so they could live. No more. I lifted my chin, my voice trembled, but it carried. "No, how dare you?" Gasps rippled again. My children froze. "How dare you erase me?" I said, louder now. "How dare you smile at tables where I am not welcome, raising glasses as though I am already dead? How dare you bury me in silence after all I gave you, my youth, my health, my body, my voice?" The hall erupted. Applause roared, drowning their fury, shaking the walls. Rebecca's face turned red. Daniel's jaw clenched. Michael's fists shook. They wanted me silent, but the louder the clapping grew, the smaller they became. For the first time in decades, I wasn't begging for their approval. I wasn't pressing my face against the window of their lives. I was my own. But even as the applause rattled the hall, a truth burned sharp as a blade in my chest. Humiliation does not die quietly, and children who bury their mother alive do not forgive her for clawing her way out. The war had only just begun. Humiliation festers. It seeps into the cracks of pride, poisoning everything it touches until it demands revenge. And that night at the hall, when applause swallowed my children's fury, I saw it in their eyes. They weren't just angry, they were humiliated. And humiliation doesn't die, it hunts. It began with whispers. At the bakery, the woman behind the counter leaned close as she handed me bread. "Your daughter was here," she murmured. "She said you forget things, that you imagine things that didn't happen." Her voice was heavy with pity, her eyes soft in that cruel way people look at someone they've already decided is broken. At the market, I heard it again, my name, spoken in hushed tones. Senile, lonely, crazy. Each word cut deeper than any bruise Robert ever left, because they weren't strangers' words. They were my children's, slipped like poison into every ear, willing to listen. Then came Aaron's turn. My son, the lawyer, polished shoes and ironed shirts, knew exactly how to wield language like a blade. One afternoon, a reporter knocked at my door. A polite young man, notebook in hand, smile practiced but sharp. "Your son says you've been struggling with your memory," he began gently, as if speaking to a child. "That some of your stories might not be reliable. Would you like to respond?" For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My son had set this man on me, dressed his attack in concern. I slammed the door. My hands shook for an hour afterward. But Michael, my baby, my winter child, he didn't hide behind silk or law books. He came himself, drunk, pounding on my door at midnight, his voice hoarse from rage. "Open up, old woman," he bellowed. "You ruined us. You made me into him." The words sliced through me like a knife. Him, his father, the monster I had shielded them from. My legs trembled as I looked out the window and saw something worse than Michael's fists. His children, my grandchildren, sitting in the car, pale faces glowing under the streetlight, watching. I opened my mouth, and before I could stop myself, I whispered, "Henry, please." My husband's ghost slipped from my lips, wearing my son's body. Michael froze at the sound of the wrong name. His face twisted, torn between rage and something else. Shame, maybe, or horror. He spat on my doorstep. "You're nothing," he slurred. "You're not their grandmother. You're dead." Then he staggered back to the car. His wife honked, urging him away. His children stared through the glass, eyes wide as he stumbled inside. I stood in the hallway, shaking so hard I thought my bones would snap, my breath ragged, my hand pressed against the wall to keep from falling. And then, slowly, I bent down, took a rag, and wiped his spit from the floor, not out of submission, out of defiance, because filth belongs to the one who spits it, not to me. Days later, an envelope slid under my door. No return address, But I knew Aaron's hand, precise, sharp, deliberate. I unfolded the paper. You are forbidden from contacting us or our children. You are forbidden from discussing private family matters in public. If you continue, we will pursue legal action. Consider this your final warning. Legal action. Against me, against their mother. I laughed when I read it. A bitter, hollow laugh that scraped my throat. Then I fed the letter into the flame of my stove and watched it curl into ash. They thought their threats would silence me. They thought whispers could bury me again, but they didn't understand. I had already been buried. I had already died once in their silence. What can the dead fear? I returned to the women's circle that week, my hands still trembling, the stink of paint and spit and threats clinging to me. I read Aaron's letter aloud. The women sat silent for a moment. Then Margaret, the one with the sharp eyes and the red scarf, all was tied at her throat, slammed her palm against the table. They want you dead in spirit, she said, but you're still breathing. That means you've already won. Ruth leaned across the circle, her hand warm on mine. You've survived worse, she whispered. And she was right, because here is the truth my children never understood. I had already lived through worse than their lies. I had already stood in front of fists and flames. Their whispers were nothing but shadows compared to the storms I had endured. But still, something in me knew. This was no longer about their shame or my survival. This was war, a war I hadn't chosen, but one they had dragged me into. And wars between mothers and children, they do not end clean. After the letter burned to ash in my stove, I thought perhaps the storm might pass. Maybe they had exhausted themselves. Maybe the silence would return, not the silence of erasure, but at least the kind that leaves you breathing. But storms don't end just because you're tired. They rage until something breaks. And something broke, not in me, in the world around me. It began with a newspaper article, a small piece tucked on the last page of the local gazette. Grandmother finds her voice through art and story. A reporter had attended one of the community gatherings and written about it. Nothing flashy, just a few paragraphs, my name, a mention of my paintings and notebooks, and a line about how her story reminds us that silence is not survival. At first, I thought no one would notice. Who reads the back page of the local paper? But people did. The very next morning, as I walked to the store, a woman I didn't know stopped me. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she pressed my hand. I read about you, she whispered. I thought I was the only one. 2 days later, a young man at the cafe leaned across the counter. Those roses you paint, they look like my mother's eyes, strong but broken. Thank you. The cafe owner overheard. He asked if I would hang my canvases on his walls. I hesitated. Why would anyone want to stare at my pain while sipping coffee? But when I returned the next week, I saw it. People pausing in front of my paintings, tilting their heads, whispering. One woman reached out, her fingers hovering as if she wanted to touch the canvas itself. And so my roses bloomed in public. The library invited me to paint a mural. The women's conference in the next city sent a letter asking if I would speak. My name began to spread, not as Rebecca's mother or Daniel's mother or Michael's mother, but as me. For the first time in my life, people said my name with respect. Not pity, not dismissal, respect. But recognition is a blade with two edges. For every stranger who saw me, my children felt their grip on me slip. And with every step I took into the light, their shadows grew darker. Rebecca struck first, draped in pearls and poison. At church luncheons, at charity dinners, she smiled sweetly while telling anyone who would listen that I wasn't well. Poor thing, she'd coo. She forgets things. Sometimes she makes up stories. We're worried about her. Her lies dripped like honey, sweet enough to be believed, and the looks I got from old neighbors changed. Soft eyes, tilted heads, pity wrapped in judgment. They didn't see a survivor. They saw a mad woman. That was Rebecca's gift, burying me in silk and sympathy. Daniel moved more deliberately. He was a lawyer now, clever and polished. One evening, the local news aired a segment. A respected attorney spoke gravely about the danger of false accusations and the tragedy of elderly delusion. They never said my name. They didn't have to. Every word was aimed at me, and in the silence that followed, I felt the weight of neighbors avoiding my gaze. And Michael. Ah, my poor Michael. He didn't polish, didn't hide. He sent threats, notes shoved under my door, jagged handwriting stained with drink. Stop before something happens. Calls in the middle of the night, heavy breathing, a slurred whisper, shut your mouth. Once, all of this would have broken me. Once, I would have torn down the paintings, burned the notebooks, begged for scraps of their love. But that woman was dead. Because here's the secret they never understood. Once you've already been buried alive, fear loses its teeth. So I kept going. At the library, I painted roses breaking through stone, thorns curling sharp as claws. Children gathered to watch, their laughter filling the space. A mother touched my arm and said, "You've given us hope." At the conference, I stood trembling before hundreds of women. My knees shook, my palms were damp, but I told them everything, the bruises, the hunger, the silence that nearly killed me, and the children who called me selfish after I gave them everything. When I finished, the applause rose like thunder. Women pressed against me, weeping, whispering, "Me too, me too, me too." That night, in a cheap hotel bed, I stared at the ceiling. For the first time in 70 years, I wasn't begging for my children's approval. I wasn't starving for their crumbs of love. I had built my own table, my own family, my own feast. But even as applause echoed in my memory, another sound pressed underneath it, a low rumble, distant, like thunder crawling closer. Because humiliation doesn't fade, it festers, and my children had been humiliated in front of neighbors, colleagues, the entire town. I could feel it in my bones. They would not forgive me for surviving. They would not forgive me for rising. And I understood, lying there in that hotel bed, that this war would not end with words. It would end with fire. The fire came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday morning when I opened my front door and smelled it. Sharp, chemical, choking. Red paint dripped across the wood, still wet, streaking down like blood. One word carved in jagged letters: liar, fraud, selfish. The stench burned my nose. Neighbors' curtains twitched, eyes peeked, then darted back. Whispers spread like smoke. Poor woman, crazy woman, dangerous woman. I stood there for a long moment, my hand pressed to the frame, my heart pounding like the fists of the man I buried decades ago. And then, do you know what I did? I laughed. A dry, bitter laugh that scraped my throat raw. Because here's what my children never understood. You cannot shame the already buried. I had already lived my funeral in their eyes. Every insult, every silence, every erasure, they had already killed me once. So I bent down, picked up a rag, and scrubbed. The paint didn't come off completely. The words sank deep into the wood like scars. So I left them there, let them stand, proof of what they had done, proof of what I had survived. But the storm didn't stop with paint. At church, Rebecca cornered me in front of women I had known for years. Her pearls gleamed like armor as she smiled that sweet, poisoned smile. Mother has been unwell, she told them. She forgets things. Sometimes she invents stories. We're just trying to protect her from herself. They looked at me then, not as a survivor, but as a patient, not with respect, but pity. That was Rebecca's gift, burying me beneath silk and sympathy. Daniel's knives cut deeper. On the evening news, he appeared immaculate in his suit, his voice low and grave. He spoke about the tragedy of elderly delusion, about how false accusations destroy families. They never said my name. They didn't have to. Everyone in town knew. And Michael, Michael didn't bother with whispers or silk. He came drunk again, pounding on my door, his voice raw with fury. "Stop this, old woman! Stop before I make you stop!" His wife dragged him away, his children's faces pale as ghosts in the car. Each attack was meant to crush me, to shove me back into silence, into the coffin they had nailed shut years ago. But every strike only fed the fire, because what more could they take? My husband was gone, my youth stolen, my health worn to bone, my children's love turned to poison. What more was left to lose? And in losing everything, I had become untouchable, so I painted. Not gentle roses anymore, no soft blooms. I painted roses with thorns sharp enough to bleed, women standing in flames, their scars glowing like metals, storms cracking open roofs, revealing skies streaked with fire. I hung them in the cafe, the library, the town hall. People stopped, stared, whispered. Some wept, some cheered, and every whisper of support was a dagger in my children's pride. The breaking point came at the library. I was finishing my mural. Roses splitting stone, thorns curling through the cracks, when the doors slammed open. The echo rattled the shelves. They entered together. Rebecca, pearls glinting like chains, her face pale with fury. Daniel, polished and precise, his jaw tight, his eyes like glass. Michael, fists clenched, dragging his children behind him like unwilling witnesses. The library froze. Students dropped their books. The librarian stopped mid-step, her hands trembling. Aaron's voice came first, cool, sharp, a blade dressed in civility. "What do you think you're doing? Defacing public property with your lies? Humiliating this family?" I stepped down from the ladder, paintbrush in hand like a weapon. My knees trembled, but I stood tall. "I'm painting. I'm telling my story." Rebecca's voice cracked like a whip. "That's not your story. That's ours. And you don't have permission." Permission. As if my bruises had belonged to them. As if my hunger had required their blessing. As if my survival had been theirs to authorize. "This is my life," I said, louder now. My voice echoed against the walls of books. "I carried you in my body. I bled for you. I shielded you from fists and storms. And now you tell me I need permission to speak? No, no more." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Michael stepped forward, his face red, his body trembling with rage. "You ruined us," he snarled. "You ruined me. You made me just like him." The air left my chest. Him, Robert, the ghost still clinging to us all. I looked at Michael, my winter child, the boy I once cradled through storms. My voice cracked, but it did not break. "I didn't ruin you, Michael. He did, and now you're finishing his work." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Shame, maybe. Doubt. His children stared at me, wide-eyed, as though seeing me for the first time. But then, Daniel's hand gripped his arm, pulling him back, steadying his fury. Rebecca turned on her heel, storming out. Daniel dragged Michael behind. The children followed, glancing over their shoulders, their faces pale with confusion. The library buzzed with whispers. My hand trembled, paint dripping from the brush onto the floor. And then I felt a hand on my arm. Margaret, her red scarf blazing like fire. "You see," she whispered, "they can scream, but you're still standing. That's the difference." And she was right. I had not crumbled. I had not begged. I had not silenced myself. But in that moment, I knew something with the certainty of a blade. This was no longer just humiliation or anger. This was war. And wars between mothers and children never end clean. The library was only a battle. The war was waiting. 2 weeks later, the invitation arrived. The town hall was hosting a full exhibition, an entire wall dedicated to my roses. Not just 1 or 2 canvases, all of them. I stared at the letter for a long time, my hands trembling. I knew the risk. My children had already smeared my name, called me delusional, dangerous, selfish. They had sent threats, paint, spit, letters full of venom. To step into the light again would mean facing their fury head on. But then I looked at the stack of canvases leaning in the corner of my apartment. Roses splitting stone, storms ripping open roofs, women standing in fire with their scars glowing like armor. Those weren't just paintings. They were my voice, and I had sworn I would never let them silence me again. So I said yes. The night of the exhibition, the hall glowed with light. My paintings lined the walls, every thorn daring to cut, every bloom clawing toward the sky. Strangers drifted from canvas to canvas, pausing, whispering. Some wept, some smiled. A woman pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "Beautiful." For a moment, I let myself believe peace was possible. that maybe, finally, the storm had spent itself. And then the doors opened. They came as a unit, my children. Rebecca in her pearls, pale with rage. Daniel in his suit, jaw clenched, eyes hard as glass. Michael, fists already balled, dragging his children behind him like prisoners of war. The air in the room shifted. Conversations hushed. All eyes turned. They approached me like a tribunal of blood. Daniel's voice cut first, smooth and sharp. You think this makes you alive? All it makes you is pathetic. Rebecca's words cracked like a whip. You've embarrassed us for the last time. And Michael, my broken boy, spat his father's venom. You should have stayed buried. For a moment, my old instincts surged. My knees weakened. My throat closed. I saw Robert's shadow behind them, fists raised, ready to break me all over again. I nearly folded, nearly. But then I looked around. I saw the roses blooming across the walls. I saw strangers watching, wide-eyed, waiting. I saw Ruth and Margaret in the crowd, their faces lit with fire, their hands already reaching for me in spirit. And I remembered. Every sacrifice, every bruise, every night of hunger, every silence I had swallowed to keep these children alive. I lifted my chin, my voice trembled, but it carried. You pretended I was dead, I said, steady now, but I lived. You erased me, but I wrote myself back. You wanted me silent, but I will not vanish, not now, not ever. Gasps rippled through the room, then applause. Hesitant at first, then louder, until the hall thundered with it. Rebecca's face burned red. Daniel muttered curses. Michael trembled with rage. They wanted me small, erased, buried. But the louder the clapping grew, the smaller they became. I turned to the crowd, my chest heaving. Do you want to know the truth? They called me selfish. After I gave them everything, I gave them my body, my youth, my health, my dreams. I stayed in hell so they could have a chance at heaven. And when I finally asked for one scrap of myself, they called me selfish. The crowd was silent, listening, holding its breath. But here is what I have learned, I said, my voice rising. Once you give everything, they will always want more. Once you erase yourself, they will call it love. And once you break the silence, they will call it betrayal. But selfish? I spread my arms wide, the paintings behind me like wings. If selfish means clawing back even one breath of freedom, then selfish is what I'll be, gladly, proudly, forever. The hall erupted. Applause crashed like thunder. Women rose to their feet. Some cried, some shouted, some reached for me as though I carried their own voices in my chest. Rebecca turned away, storming out. Daniel followed, jaw clenched tight. Michael lingered, his children tugging at his sleeve. For a flicker of a moment, something broke in his face. Shame, maybe, or sorrow. His eyes met mine, just once, before he dropped his gaze and walked out without a word. And then it was only me, the roses, and the roar of applause shaking the walls. I stood taller than I ever had. My knees trembled, my hands shook, but my voice was steady. So hear me now, whoever you are, wherever you sit. If your children call you selfish, if your family erases you, if the people you bled for pretend you are already dead, rise anyway, because silence is not golden. Silence is a coffin, and I have clawed my way out. I am alive. I am seen. I am heard, and I will never be silent again.